At 5:12 a.m., I woke to the kind of sound that flips your stomach before your brain even catches up. Metal grinding against metal, a low hydraulic groan, and then a sudden thud that shook my windows. For a split second, I thought an accident happened on the street. But then I heard it. Voices, low, smug, too awake for dawn, and one of them saying the words that turned my blood cold. "Yeah, hook it fast. He won't see it coming." I shot out of bed, heart pounding, and yanked the curtain open just in time to witness a scene so surreal, so ridiculous, so infuriating that I honestly thought I was still dreaming. My car, my perfectly legal, fully registered, mechanically flawless car, was already lifted halfway onto a tow truck. 3 HOA board members stood beside it like they were posing for a villain poster. Arms folded, matching neon vests, self-satisfied grins plastered across their faces. And leading them was Shelley, the HOA president, a woman whose personality was 90% control issues and 10% iced coffee. She spotted my silhouette at the window, lifted her clipboard like a trophy, and shouted loud enough to wake the entire neighborhood. "This is what happens when you ignore community color standards. Color standards. Not noise. Not trash. Not permits. Not parking violations. No, my car's color. It wasn't even neon or reflective or offensive. It was a deep, matte, burnt orange wrap I'd gotten as a birthday gift to myself. But apparently, according to the new Aesthetic Harmony Ordinance, which the HOA passed during a meeting I never even knew happened, my car was non-compliant with neighborhood. Chromatic cohesion. Basically, it didn't match the approved shade set. I stormed outside barefoot, adrenaline making me forget the cold concrete under my feet. "You can't tow my car without notice," I shouted. Shelley pivoted toward me, eyes gleaming with the kind of power that only petty tyrants enjoy. "We posted the warning yesterday. Community Rulebook, page 17. Vehicle color must be neutral or HOA approved. You had your chance." "Where did you post it?" I demanded. "On the bulletin board behind the clubhouse," she said without even blinking. The clubhouse that was under renovation. The clubhouse none of us could access. The clubhouse whose path was blocked by fencing and debris. They knew exactly what they were doing. And as the tow truck lurched forward, dragging my car away like some kind of stolen trophy, something inside me clicked. Not anger, not fear. Strategy. Because if they wanted a cat-and-mouse game, I was about to become the cat with sharper claws than they ever expected. By the time the tow truck disappeared around the corner, the sun was barely rising, but I was already wide awake, with a kind of clarity that only comes when someone pushes you too far. I wasn't just going to get my car back. I was going to unravel whatever twisted power trip the HOA had been brewing behind closed doors. And I had a feeling this color violation was only the tip of something rotten. I went back inside, grabbed my phone, and started documenting everything. Photos of the street, the curb, the driveway, the exact position where my car had been parked. Every shadow, every angle. If they wanted a legal fight, I was preparing for one. But before I could decide my next move, my neighbor, Mr. Langford, shuffled onto his porch in his robe and slippers. "I saw the whole thing," he whispered urgently. "You didn't hear it from me, but there's a file with your name on it." I stopped cold. "A file?" He nodded. "Shelley's been keeping tabs. On you, on a few of us. Ever since she got reelected, she's been different." Different was an understatement. Ever since her promotion to president, she'd treated the HOA like a miniature kingdom, and we were all involuntary citizens. Langford leaned closer, eyes darting around like the bushes had ears. "The file's in the office at the clubhouse. They store everything there. Meeting notes, complaints, fines, photos. If she's targeting you, you'll find proof." "But the office is locked," I said. He cracked a thin smile. "Not if you have the old maintenance passcode." Before I could ask how he knew it, he wrote 4 numbers on the palm of my hand with a trembling finger. "Don't tell anyone I gave you this." He shuffled back inside before I could thank him. My heart was pounding again, but this time, not from panic, from opportunity. I waited until early afternoon when the construction workers took their lunch break, and the clubhouse area emptied out. The fencing was loose on the south side, probably because the workers kept slipping through for smoke breaks. I pulled it back just enough to squeeze through and made my way toward the office door, which was hidden behind temporary plywood walls. There it was, a keypad. I punched in the code. Beep. Click. The lock slid open. The room smelled like stale paper and cheap disinfectant. Filing cabinets lined the walls. Clipboards hung from hooks. And right there on the desk, like they didn't even bother hiding it, was a thick manila folder with my name written across it in red marker. I opened it, and what I saw inside didn't just confirm my suspicions. It detonated them. Photos of my car, printouts of my social media, notes about my work schedule, a checklist titled, Compliance pressure points. This wasn't enforcement. This was a coordinated takedown. And now I knew it. I stood frozen in the cramped office, the manila folder open in my hands, my breath shallow as I flipped through, page after page of what could only be described as a coordinated campaign. Not a spontaneous HOA action. Not a random enforcement day. No, this was premeditated, strategic, and disturbingly personal. One page showed a printed screenshot of my burnt orange car, circled in red with a handwritten note. Primary leverage asset. Another page listed dates, my dates. Days I left early for work, days I came home late, days I ran errands. They weren't just observing me, they were tracking me. But the worst page? A typed document titled, Phase 2, Property Compliance Escalation. Underneath bullet points that made my stomach drop. Fence height review. Shed permit audit. Landscaping conformity inspection. Possible noise ordinance citation. Emergency meeting for pattern of disregard. They planned to bury me in fines, notices, and penalties until I either surrendered, sold the house, or fell into line like the rest of the neighborhood they controlled. My car had just been the opening move in a much larger game. I turned the page. More photos. Some taken from angles no neighbor should have access to. My backyard. My side gate, even one of me grilling last weekend. Someone had been sneaking onto my property. A cold shiver crawled down my spine. This wasn't just petty. This was targeted harassment. Footsteps suddenly echoed from outside. A short, heavy stride. My body tensed. I slammed the folder shut, slipped it under my jacket, and quietly edged toward the door. The footsteps stopped right outside. A shadow passed under the crack. Then the doorknob rattled. I held my breath. Another rattle, harder this time, followed by an irritated grunt. Shelley's voice. Why isn't this stupid door locking properly? Construction ruins everything. She jiggled it again. I froze, every muscle tight, ready to either bluff, hide, or run. But then, blessedly, someone called her from across the lot. Shelley, we need you to check the paint samples. Her footsteps turned away. The shadow disappeared. I waited a full 30 seconds before slipping out, closing the door silently behind me, and making my way back through the loose fence panel. My heart hammered all the way home. Inside, I dropped the folder onto my kitchen table and stared at it like it was a bomb. Because in a way it was. But a bomb can be dangerous. Or it can be used. If the HOA wanted a war, they just handed me their battle plan. And I wasn't about to play defense. I spent the next hour pacing my kitchen like a caged animal. The stolen HOA folder spread across the table like a villain's blueprint. Every page I reread sparked a new surge of disbelief. Then anger, then something sharper, purpose. They wanted to pressure me into compliance? Force me out? Break me with bureaucracy? Fine, but they had made one fatal mistake. They underestimated how methodical I can be. I sat down, took a deep breath, and started organizing the contents of the file. Photos in one stack, notes in another, schedules, meeting minutes, violation forms. As I laid it all out, patterns started to emerge. They weren't just tracking me, they were coordinating. With someone inside the construction crew. Several notes referenced after-hours access, and used back gate for observation. That meant at least one worker was helping them. Good, that was leverage. But the real gold was tucked at the bottom of the folder. A draft memo. Shelley planned to distribute to the neighborhood next week. The headline alone made my eyes widen. Community safety notice, resident exhibiting. Repeated aggressive and non-compliant behavior. She was about to smear me publicly. Turn the entire neighborhood against me before I even knew what was happening. That was when the plan clicked into place. Not revenge, not sabotage, but exposure. Not a single thing in their file was legal. Unauthorized surveillance, trespassing, targeted enforcement, predatory fines. If I played this right, I could dismantle their entire leadership structure. All I needed was one thing, proof they were still doing it. So I set a trap. I grabbed a small motion-activated camera from my home security drawer, a backup unit I'd never used, and headed to the backyard. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the fence. Line, perfect. I positioned the camera between two cinder blocks facing my side gate, angled low and slightly hidden. If anyone tried to sneak in again, I'd have video evidence. Next, I printed a fake notice of appeal form and taped it to my back door. It wasn't real, but it looked real enough. Dense text, legal phrasing, a forged HOA letterhead. Anyone snooping around would see it. Assume I was preparing to fight the tow and report it to Shelley. And knowing her, she'd send someone to gather more documentation. I wanted them to come. I needed them to come. Night fell slowly, the quiet settling into the neighborhood like a thick blanket. Through the blinds I watched the street. Lights flicked on in windows. Sprinklers clicked on. Cars rolled into driveways. Then, just before 10 p.m., a figure appeared near the clubhouse fence, hood up, flashlight off, moving like someone who didn't want to be seen. They were headed straight toward my property. My trap was working. The figure moved with a kind of cautious confidence, like someone who'd done this before. Not a teenager sneaking around. Not a random passerby, no. This was someone who knew exactly where they were going and why. The hood, the careful pacing, the way they paused to look up and down the street before crossing, it all screamed one thing. HOA affiliated. I stayed low behind my living room window, lights off, breath shallow. The figure slipped through the narrow path between my garage and the neighbor's fence, the same gap that led directly to my side gate. My camera was pointed right at that spot. If they touched that gate, even if they just leaned in close, it would capture everything. Footsteps crunched on the gravel. A faint metallic clink echoed as the gate latch was tested. They weren't even trying to be subtle. "Come on," I whispered, watching through the blinds. The figure tugged the gate again. Harder this time. It didn't budge. The deadbolt I installed 2 months ago held strong. But they weren't here to enter quietly. They were here to observe or take photos. Sure enough, the hooded figure lifted a phone and snapped 2 pictures of the back of my property. Flash off, but I still saw the faint illumination on their hands. Then they moved to the back door, exactly where I'd placed the fake notice. I inched forward to get a better view. The figure leaned in, reading the printed appeal form. They pulled their phone up again and snapped several pictures. Wide shots, close shots, angled shots. Documentation, just like I expected. They were gathering evidence for Shelley. They needed proof I was preparing to challenge the citation, which would justify an escalation. Good. Perfect. Take as many photos as you want. Then, something unexpected happened. The figure lowered their hood. It wasn't a construction worker. It wasn't a random board member. It was Derek, Shelley's right-hand enforcer and one of the most aggressive HOA board members on the roster. The same guy who once fined a family for having a Halloween decoration up one day too long. The same guy who followed residents on his bike to ensure proper leash compliance. And now he was trespassing on my property at 10 p.m. My camera caught everything, but the night wasn't done giving me gifts. As Derek stepped away from the back door, he pulled out a 2-way radio, a heavy, bulky one. Not a cheap walkie-talkie, a proper HOA-issued communication device. He pressed the button, and his voice carried through the quiet air. "Shelley, it's me." Yeah, he definitely saw the notice. He's planning something. I'll send the photos in 10. I froze, not because of the radio, not because of the photos, but because I heard another voice on the line. Staticky, but unmistakable. Good, move to phase 2. Phase 2. It wasn't just in the file. It was already happening. And I had just caught the orchestrator in real time. The figure moved with a kind of cautious confidence, like someone who'd done this before. Not a teenager sneaking around. Not a random passerby, no. This was someone who knew exactly where they were going and why. The hood, the careful pacing, the way they paused to look up and down the street before crossing. It all screamed one thing. HOA affiliated. I stayed low behind my living room window, lights off, breath shallow. The figure slipped through the narrow path between my garage and the neighbor's fence, the same gap that led directly to my side gate. My camera was pointed right at that spot. If they touched that gate, even if they just leaned in close, it would capture everything. Footsteps crunched on the gravel. A faint metallic clink echoed as the gate latch was tested. They weren't even trying to be subtle. "Come on," I whispered, watching through the blinds. The figure tugged the gate again. Harder this time. It didn't budge. The deadbolt I installed 2 months ago held strong. But they weren't here to enter quietly. They were here to observe or take photos. Sure enough, the hooded figure lifted a phone and snapped 2 pictures of the back of my property. Flash off, but I still saw the faint illumination on their hands. Then they moved to the back door, exactly where I'd placed the fake notice. I inched forward to get a better view. The figure leaned in, reading the printed appeal form. They pulled their phone up again and snapped several pictures. Wide shots, close shots, angled shots. Documentation, just like I expected. They were gathering evidence for Shelley. They needed proof I was preparing to challenge the citation, which would justify an escalation. Good. Perfect. Take as many photos as you want. Then something unexpected happened. The figure lowered their hood. It wasn't a construction worker. It wasn't a random board member. It was Derek, Shelley's right-hand enforcer and one of the most aggressive HOA board members on the roster. The same guy who once fined a family for having a Halloween decoration up one day too long. The same guy who followed residents on his bike to ensure proper leash compliance. And now he was trespassing on my property at 10 p.m. My camera caught everything. But the night wasn't done giving me gifts. As Derek stepped away from the back door, he pulled out a 2-way radio, a heavy, bulky one. Not a cheap walkie-talkie, a proper HOA-issued communication device. He pressed the button and his voice carried through the quiet air. Shelly, it's me. Yeah, he definitely saw the notice. He's planning something. I'll send the photos in 10. I froze. Not because of the radio. Not because of the photos. But because I heard another voice on the line. Staticky, but unmistakable. Good. Move to Phase 2. Phase 2. It wasn't just in the file. It was already happening. And I had just caught the orchestrator in real time. I barely slept that night. Not from fear, no. Fear had burned away hours ago. What kept me awake was calculation. Derek's trespassing, his radio call. Shelly calmly ordering Phase 2 like she was running a tactical operation. Not a neighborhood association. My camera had captured everything. His face, his actions, his report. And now, with the stolen HOA file spread across my dining table, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. By 5 a.m., the neighborhood was still dark. Still quiet, still pretending to be normal. Streetlights hummed. Sprinklers sputtered in the distance. I made coffee, sat down, and rewatched the night's footage on my laptop. Every frame was better than I hoped. Clear, crisp, time-stamped. The kind of evidence lawyers salivate over. But just as I saved the final clip to a secure folder, headlights swept across my kitchen wall. A car slowed, stopped. I stiffened. Another set of headlights appeared. Parked across the street. Then a third. 3 vehicles. No engines cutting off. No doors opening. Just silent, idling watchers. So Phase 2 wasn't subtle. It was intimidation. I kept the lights off as I peeked between the blinds. The cars were dark-colored sedans, unmarked but familiar. I'd seen them during HOA compliance patrols. Shelly's pride and joy. Purchased with community funds under the guise of neighborhood safety. Inside the nearest one sat a woman holding a clipboard. Phase 2 had officially begun. I grabbed my phone and started recording the scene. Every angle, every plate number, every person I could glimpse inside those cars. If they wanted to monitor me, I'd document them right back. At 6:10 a.m., movement stirred across the street. The woman with the clipboard stepped out and marched up to my property line. She didn't step onto my land, she knew better than that. But she planted a bright yellow notice, right on the curb, and snapped a photo for her records. I walked outside, calm and deliberate. She startled. "Sir, please do not interfere with an active HOA compliance check." "I'm not interfering," I said, picking up the notice. "I'm participating." She stiffened. The notice was a joke, another fabricated violation. According to them, my front yard vegetation ratio was non-compliant and required immediate correction. Translation? They were escalating the pressure exactly as described in their file. I looked the woman dead in the eyes. "This notice is illegal," I said evenly. "But don't worry, I'm collecting them." She blinked fast, uncertain. "Sir, you'll need to direct any disputes to the board." "Oh, I will," I said. "Sooner than you think." Before she could respond, her radio crackled. A familiar voice spilled out. "Is he cooperating?" "Shelly." The woman hesitated. "He acknowledged the notice." "Good," Shelly replied. "Prepare the next one." The woman swallowed hard. Next one? How many more were coming? It didn't matter. Let them pile them up. Let them escalate. Because with every violation they delivered, every car they parked, every order Shelly gave over that radio, they were building my case for me. By 7:30 a.m., the sun had risen enough to cast long shadows across the street and enough to reveal just how many compliance vehicles Shelly had sent. Not 3, not even 4. 6 HOA sedans now lined the curb like I lived in some restricted government facility rather than a quiet suburban neighborhood. If intimidation was the goal, they overshot it so far they circled back into comedy. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains. A jogger slowed down, staring like I was filming a crime drama in my driveway. Even the mailman hesitated before approaching my street, probably wondering if he needed body armor to deliver envelopes today. I stood on my porch, arms folded, letting the HOA see me seeing them. Let them take photos. Let them document my expression. The more they recorded, the more evidence I'd have of the harassment. At 7:45 sharp, the next one arrived exactly as Shelly promised. This time, 2 board members stepped out. Clipboard woman plus a bearded guy named Martin, the HOA treasurer. Martin always wore khaki shorts and an expression that suggested no one had ever explained boundaries to him. Today, he looked extra self-important as he marched up with a stack of papers like he was serving court orders. "Per HOA regulations," he announced loudly, "you are being issued a formal landscaping audit notice." I kept my voice calm. "Martin, my landscaping was approved when I bought the house." He smirked. "Yes, but standards change." Funny. The only thing that had changed was Shelly's paranoia. Clipboard woman added, "We'll need to take measurements of your yard. Front, sides, and back." I raised a brow. You won't be entering my property. We have authorization, Martin puffed. No, I said. You don't. He shoved a paper at me. It's all here. I took it, scanned the header, and nearly laughed. The authorization letter wasn't signed. Not by the board. Not by the association. Not by anyone. Just a blank line. Martin, I said slowly, holding up the paper. You're handing me an official HOA document with no signatures. His face twitched. It must be a printing error. And the last notice? I asked. Also unsigned? Clipboard woman swallowed. Her silence answered for her. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only they could hear. Do you have any idea how illegal it is to issue enforcement notices without board approval? Or enter private property without a signed authorization? Martin's bravado cracked. We were told you wouldn't. Check that. Told by who? I asked even though I already knew the answer. His eyes flickered toward his radio. A bad sign. For them. Before either could retreat, I lifted my phone and snapped a photo of both of them holding the unsigned notices. What are you doing? Clipboard woman gasped. Documenting, I said. Just like you. Martin blanched. We need to report this. Please do, I smiled. Tell Shelley I said, good morning. They scrambled back to their cars, rattled, whispering into their radios. Shelley had made her biggest mistake yet. She sent amateurs to do dirty work that required professionals. And now I had proof, incompetent, illegal proof, stacking higher by the hour. By the time Martin and Clipboard Woman retreated to their caravan of HOA sedans, I had a small mountain of illegal notices, time-stamped photos, and video evidence piling up on my kitchen table. Every single thing they'd done that morning was another nail in their own coffin. And they weren't slowing down, if anything. The pace of their escalation suggested Shelley was panicking more than she was controlling. Good. Let her panic. At 8:12 a.m., as I was labeling the footage files, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Normally I'd ignore it, but something told me to answer. Hello? A male voice exhaled shakily. Is this the owner of the burnt orange car? I paused. Who's asking? Don't hang up, it's Evan. I work with the construction crew at the clubhouse. That got my attention. What do you want? Another shaky breath. I need to warn you. They're trying to set you up, and I can't be part of it anymore. I leaned forward. Slow down. What setup? You don't understand, he whispered urgently. Shelley told us to leave the south fence loose so certain board members could get in at night. And she said if anyone asked, we were supposed to say you'd been acting aggressive toward the workers. My jaw clenched. Aggressive how? She said you yelled at us last week. Said you threatened someone with tools. We all know it didn't happen, but she's writing it up for the community newsletter. I've seen the draft, so the smear campaign wasn't just planned. It was already written. And that's not the worst part, he added. She told Martin to file a noise complaint tonight, even if you don't make any noise. Fabricated, pre-planned, weaponized policy. Exactly like the folder in my house had shown. Why are you telling me this? I asked. His voice cracked. Because she said she'd blame the crew if anything went wrong. And after last night, she's saying something did go wrong. I froze. Last night? Yes, he whispered. She said someone saw you sneaking around the clubhouse office. She said you broke in. My pulse spiked. There it was. The counterattack. She's planning to call a board meeting this afternoon, he continued. She wants to vote on issuing you an emergency termination of privileges notice. I sat back in my chair. Termination of privileges was HOA code for no amenities, no facilities access, no parking permissions, no voting rights, no appeals. Basically, she wanted to strip me of every right as a resident. Illegally. Thank you for telling me, I said quietly. You didn't hear it from me, he said. Please, I can't get dragged into this. He hung up before I could say anything else. I set my phone down slowly, my mind racing. Shelley wanted a vote? She wanted a meeting? Perfect. Because while she was preparing to weaponize the rules, I was preparing to expose everything she'd done. And all I needed was the right moment. By late morning, the neighborhood had settled into a strange, uncomfortable rhythm. Like everyone sensed something was brewing but didn't know where to look. HOA sedans still lurked on the street. Clipboard Woman and Martin paced around like jumpy mall cops. And me? I was inside, assembling the evidence, package that would blow their entire operation open like a rotten piñata. At 11:03 a.m., my phone pinged. HOA emergency notice. An urgent board meeting will be held at 1 p.m. at the clubhouse. Attendance required for parties directly involved. There it was. Shelley's attempt at the kill shot. I smirked. Not today. I printed copies of everything. The trespassing photos. The nighttime footage of Derek. Screenshots of unsigned notices. Even the tracking schedule they'd kept on me like I was some FBI target. I added the fake, aggressive incident notes from the stolen folder and highlighted the part about fabricating behavior. By the time I finished, my binder looked less like a resident complaint and more like a case file from a federal investigation. At 12:45, I walked toward the clubhouse, calm, deliberate, binder in hand. The construction fence had been resecured. The gate was padlocked. Shelley wasn't taking chances today. Board members trickled into the building, including Derek, who avoided eye contact like a kid caught stealing candy. Martin clutched his clipboard like a security blanket. Clipboard woman hovered near the door, already sweating. Shelley arrived last. Sunglasses, power walk, the confidence of a dictator who believes the troops will obey no matter what. When she saw me, she smirked. I hope you came prepared. This meeting will be short. Oh, I'm sure it will be, I said. We entered the small makeshift meeting room inside the clubhouse. Folding tables, plastic chairs, a projector someone didn't know how to turn on. The perfect setting for a petty tyrant's downfall. Shelley cleared her throat. This emergency session concerns resident. Before you continue, I said calmly, placing my binder on the table. I have evidence to submit for the record. Her smile faltered. Just a flicker, but I saw it. Evidence? She repeated, masking the tremor in her voice. This isn't a trial. This is a disciplinary meeting. Then it should be very quick, I said, opening the binder. The room fell silent. First, I slid forward a high-resolution still image of Derek trespassing on my property at 10 p.m. Shelley blinked. Hard. Next, a stack of unsigned violation notices. Clipboard woman's face drained of color. Then a series of screenshots. Every internal document from Shelley's secret folder, including Phase 2, termination strategy, and their tracking list. Martin actually whispered, "Oh my God." Finally, I placed my phone on the table and pressed play. Derek's voice crackled through the speaker. Shelley, it's me. He's definitely planning something. Moving to Phase 2. Shelley's voice followed. Good. Prepare the next one. The room froze. No one breathed. Shelley's mouth opened, closed, opened again. That audio is taken out of context, she snapped. Really? I asked. Want to hear the part where you accuse me of breaking into this office before you even checked the locks? Her eyes widened. I tapped to the next clip. The recording played. Shelley's voice echoed through the room. I don't care what evidence exists. We're writing him up for the break-in. There it was. Their entire scheme spoken straight from her own mouth. The board members slowly turned to look at her. Not with respect, not with fear, but with something she'd never expected, distrust. And the meeting was just beginning. The silence in the room didn't just hang, it pressed, heavy, suffocating. Every board member stared at Shelley like they were seeing her for the first time, and not in a flattering way. She tried to maintain that trademark iron posture, but her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her clipboard. A tremor, tiny but unmistakable. Everyone needs to calm down, she said, voice tight. This resident has clearly manipulated. Manipulated? I cut in. Your own voice? Derek's face on video? The timestamps from HOA issued radios? Martin leaned forward slowly. Shelley, is that really your voice? She shot him a glare sharp enough to slice steel. Of course it's my voice, but this is obviously edited. I slid another document forward. This is the metadata from the audio. Files, uncut, unaltered, straight from my security system. Clipboard woman's eyes widened. You have metadata? You know, Derek muttered under his breath. He did warn us he records everything. Shelley rounded on him. And you, why were you even on his property last night? Derek flinched. Because you ordered— Shut up! She snapped. The room went cold. Every board member stiffened. Hearing their president panic was like watching a crack split through a dam. Once it starts, it doesn't stop. I opened the binder to the next set of papers. Before we go any further, let's talk about these. I placed the pages labeled Phase 2, Compliance Pressure Points, and Behavioral Monitoring Initiative, onto the table like a prosecutor laying out evidence in a courtroom. Martin, the treasurer, and the only person in the HOA with basic common sense, leaned over them squinting. Shelley, I've never seen any of this. These aren't approved programs. They were going to be, she insisted. At the next board vote. When were you planning to tell us? Clipboard woman whispered. When you needed to know, Shelley hissed. That was it. The crack widened. I leaned back in my chair, letting the implosion continue on its own. You tracked his schedule? Martin said, voice rising. You took photos of his backyard? Without consent? It's compliance, Shelley argued. Everything we've done is for community safety. Safety? I repeated. Is that why you had workers leave the fence open at night? Is that why you fabricated a story accusing me of threatening someone? She froze. A second passed. 2. Then, you can't prove that. I calmly slid forward the last piece. A printed text transcript. Of the call from Evan, the construction worker who'd warned me. I can, I said softly. Shelley's face drained of color. Martin stood abruptly. Shelley, this is misconduct. Serious misconduct. Clipboard woman nodded. We could be legally liable. All of you will be, I said. Unless you take immediate action to correct this. Derek whispered. What does that mean? It means, I said, folding my hands. This meeting isn't about disciplining me. Every eye in the room turned toward Shelley. It's about removing a corrupt president. Shelley's jaw dropped. And for the first time since this war began, she looked afraid. The tension in the clubhouse room was electric, a storm brewing in slow motion. Shelley's face was pale. The kind of pale that only appears when your empire begins to crumble in front of your own eyes. Her usual armor of smug confidence had cracked, and now every board member could see the rot behind it. Martin cleared his throat, the tremor in his voice betraying both fear and disbelief. Shelley, all of this, these photos, the audio, the unauthorized surveillance, it's illegal. We could all be sued personally if we don't act. Clipboard woman nodded vigorously. And the way you coordinated Phase 2, targeting a resident, fabricating complaints, it's unethical, Shelley. Shelley opened her mouth, then closed it, repeatedly. Each word she tried to form seemed trapped behind the rising panic. Finally, she hissed, You don't understand. I was protecting the community. Everything we did was for the neighborhood's cohesion. I shook my head slowly, calmly. Community cohesion doesn't involve trespassing, false claims, and secret surveillance. What you've done isn't protection. It's control. And it's illegal. The board members exchanged glances. Martin's hands gripped the edge of the table. Clipboard. Woman's mouth twitched as if she wanted to speak but wasn't sure if she dared. Derek looked anywhere but at Shelley, his own fear now overshadowing the bravado he'd carried for months. Finally, Martin spoke, voice firm this time. We need to vote. Shelley, you're suspended from your role as HOA president immediately. Effective today, until an official investigation is conducted. You have no authority over this board, and no access to private resident information. Shelley's eyes narrowed, anger mixed with disbelief. You can't just, this is my HOA. I was elected. I know, I said softly, leaning forward, but being elected doesn't give you the right to break laws or harass neighbors. You crossed a line, and now, the board is doing the right thing. Clipboard woman stood, hands shaking, and added, We've all been afraid of Shelley's power for too long. But this is criminal. Shelley's face turned a deep shade of red. She opened her mouth to argue again. But Derek, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. She's right. We all need to follow legal procedures. If we don't, we're liable too. The room fell silent for a heartbeat. Then the board began to discuss logistics, how to report the misconduct, how to protect residents, and how to ensure no similar abuse of power could happen again. I sat back and watched, binder in hand, feeling the slow burn of victory. This wasn't over. I still had to ensure the HOA cleaned up its mess. But for the first time, I felt the power shift. The predator had become the prey. Shelley slumped in her chair, defeated, her once commanding presence reduced to a trembling, silent figure. The board members had finally seen the truth, and they were acting on it. For the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of calm. The dawn that had begun, with my car being towed in silence, had ended, with justice quietly settling over the neighborhood like a slow, deliberate tide. And the game, my game, was only just beginning. The meeting ended, but the battle wasn't over. Shelley was suspended, yes, but I knew her ego and stubbornness meant she wouldn't vanish quietly. The damage she had already attempted, the falsified violations, the secret surveillance, the intimidation, could have lingering consequences if left unchecked. I needed to expose the full scheme to ensure accountability and protect the rest of the neighborhood. Back at my house, I spread everything out on the dining table again. The folder from the clubhouse office, the videos from my backyard, screenshots from Evan's warnings, and the night footage of Derek. Every piece connected. Every line of evidence told a single story. Shelley had orchestrated an illegal and deeply personal harassment campaign. It wasn't just me. Anyone who refused to comply with her arbitrary rules could have been next. I started compiling it all digitally, creating a clear timeline. Phase 1. My car was towed for color non-compliance before sunrise. Phase 2. Surveillance and fabricated complaints were set in motion, including night trespassing and falsified incident reports. Phase 3. Escalation to a public smear campaign via HOA channels. Each step included timestamps, names, photos, and audio recordings. By the time I finished, I had a dossier that could withstand legal scrutiny. I wasn't just preparing to defend myself anymore. I was preparing to take action against the abuse of power itself. Next, I drafted an email to the HOA board, attaching the full digital evidence and providing a concise, clear report of all violations and misconduct. I included suggestions for immediate remedial steps, reversing all unfounded notices, implementing checks on board authority, and involving legal counsel to ensure compliance with local laws. The tone was firm but neutral, because this wasn't about personal revenge. This was about exposing corruption and protecting the neighborhood. Before sending it, I took a deep breath and paused. One click would set the dominoes in motion. It would also ensure Shelley couldn't manipulate anyone else with her fear tactics. Finally, I pressed send. Almost immediately, my phone buzzed with notifications. Board members were responding. Questions, clarifications, expressions of shock. Derek texted me, carefully worded. "We didn't know it was this bad. Good work." Even Martin and Clipboard Woman started calling me to confirm details. Within hours, an emergency board session was called, not just to handle my complaints, but to review all actions Shelley had taken since her election. She was now under scrutiny from every angle: legal counsel, board oversight, and the resident community. The game had flipped completely. I leaned back, exhausted but satisfied. The car, the notices, the secret files. It was all part of a larger war that Shelley thought she could control. But now, she was on the defensive, and I held all the cards. And just like that, the twisted cat-and-mouse game she had started at dawn was unraveling. Her moves had been predictable, sloppy, and meticulously documented. I couldn't help but smile. After sending the full dossier to the board, I noticed a subtle shift in the neighborhood atmosphere. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact during HOA patrols now waved as I walked past. Some even approached cautiously, offering quiet thanks or curious questions. It was as if they had been waiting for someone to expose the truth. And now, finally, someone had. The HOA sedans still patrolled occasionally, but they were noticeably quieter. No more brazen photos in the dark. No more printed notices left at the curb. The intimidation factor had dissipated, replaced by a cautious uncertainty that I could practically smell in the air. Shelley's absence from public HOA activity only made it more obvious. Her power had been neutered, at least temporarily. I spent the morning following up with the board members. Martin called first. "We're taking this seriously," he admitted. "There are multiple violations and legal counsel has been brought in. We're reversing all the notices issued against you and anyone else they targeted." Clipboard Woman chimed in shortly afterward, almost whispering. I never realized how far Shelley had gone. I'm sorry it took this long for someone to stand up. I reassured them that it wasn't about apologies. It was about making sure the system didn't let this happen again. Then there were the subtle gestures from neighbors. The old couple across the street waved from their porch. A teenager riding by slowed down and mouthed, "Thanks." It was a small but powerful reminder that the HOA's authority had limits, and people could reclaim agency when given evidence and guidance. By late afternoon, news of Shelley's suspension had spread. Rumors circulated. The HOA president overstepped again. Someone caught her in secret surveillance. The board is investigating misconduct. The community was alive with whispered conversations, emails, and social media posts discussing the exposure of her tactics. People were talking, and the more they talked, the more the truth sank in. I kept meticulous records of every interaction, knowing that the more transparent and documented the process, the stronger the case for reform. Every call, every email, every friendly gesture from a neighbor became a symbol that the cat-and-mouse game had shifted. Now the cat was fully awake, and the mice, Shelley and her enforcers, were cornered. Later that evening, I stood in my driveway, looking at my burnt orange car, now safely back where it belonged. The color hadn't changed, but the meaning had. It wasn't just a car anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, proof that meticulous planning and careful documentation could turn intimidation into exposure. Shelley had underestimated me, and the neighborhood had underestimated the truth. Now everyone was paying attention, and I wasn't done yet. The next morning, I woke to an email from the HOA's legal counsel. They had reviewed my dossier, the photos, the audio, and the printed notices. The subject line alone set my heart racing. Urgent, misconduct review and immediate remedial action. The email detailed a series of steps. All illegally issued notices were to be officially rescinded. A formal apology to me would be issued, and the board was initiating an internal review of all actions taken by Shelley and her close enforcers over the past year. Finally, they advised that Shelley herself could face legal consequences if the misconduct was confirmed. I leaned back in my chair, sipping coffee, feeling a rare combination of satisfaction and relief. The wheels of accountability were finally turning, and this time they were moving fast. But I knew better than to assume victory was complete. Shelley had a history of trying to manipulate situations when she felt cornered. That meant I had to remain vigilant. Every document had to be tracked, every board action monitored, and every neighbor who had witnessed her aggressive tactics had to be prepared to corroborate the events. By mid-morning, I began drafting a timeline of events to send to the board and legal counsel, a concise, clear record starting with the dawn tow of my car and extending to the recent evidence of Phase 2 operations. It included screenshots of Evan's warnings, the trespassing footage, Derek's radio communications, and the entire sequence of fabricated violations. Every piece meticulously labeled, every date and time verified. While compiling the timeline, my phone rang. It was Martin. "We're officially filing for an emergency review of the HOA president's conduct," he said. "We've already called for a meeting next week, but with your evidence, legal counsel is recommending we expedite the process." I smiled. "Good. It's time the community sees everything." Clipboard woman followed up shortly after, adding, "Residents are coming forward, now that they know someone is taking a stand." I didn't realize how many had been intimidated. I listened, letting the information sink in. Shelley had built an entire system of control and fear, but that system was fragile. Once cracks formed, the dominoes started to fall, and those afraid to speak up began to find courage. By late afternoon, the board had sent out notices to all residents explaining that an internal review was underway and that all previously issued compliance violations related to my car, landscaping, or other arbitrary infractions were voided immediately. Word spread quickly, and neighbors I had never met personally started reaching out. Texts, messages, even face-to-face acknowledgments of what had happened. For the first time, the neighborhood felt like a community again, not a surveillance state run by a petty dictator. And I knew the best part. The process had just begun. Shelley's overreach would not go unnoticed, and her carefully orchestrated cat-and-mouse game had already backfired spectacularly. I leaned back, eyes on the now peaceful street, thinking the legal moves had begun. But the final play was still ahead. After the board began the internal review, a remarkable change swept through the neighborhood. People who had previously kept their heads down suddenly found their voices. Emails poured into the board, each recounting incidents of harassment, intimidation, and arbitrary fines, details that Shelley had tried to bury. Residents I barely knew were stepping forward, their accounts, forming a network of corroboration that strengthened my case exponentially. By mid-morning, I was receiving messages from neighbors I'd never spoken to before. One elderly couple described how Shelley had fined them for a decorative statue that wasn't even visible from the street. A young family detailed how their garage schedule had been monitored and recorded, apparently for compliance review. Another neighbor sent me photos of unsigned notices stapled to their front doors, notice after notice that mirrored the exact Phase 2 methods Shelley had planned for me. I realized something vital. Once the first domino fell, all the others began to topple. Shelley had operated under the illusion that residents were too afraid or apathetic to act. Now the truth had surfaced, and people weren't just talking, they were documenting. At noon, I met briefly with Martin and Clipboard Woman to coordinate next steps. "We're compiling all witness statements," Martin explained. "Residents are willing to testify if necessary. We'll need a complete package ready for legal review." Clipboard Woman added, "They're afraid, but the evidence you provided gave them courage. They feel like they can finally speak without repercussions." I nodded, feeling the weight of months of strategy and observation pay off. My own meticulous documentation had sparked something bigger. Shelley hadn't just targeted me. She had created a culture of fear, and now that culture was unraveling because the neighborhood had learned they weren't alone. That evening, a small group of neighbors knocked on my door. They didn't want to talk about HOA politics. They wanted to thank me. One of them, a middle-aged man who had once avoided confrontation entirely, said quietly, "We saw how she treated you. We didn't realize it was happening to all of us. You showed us we don't have to take it." I smiled, humbly but determined. "It's not just me," I said. "It's all of us together. That's the only way she'll learn that fear isn't authority." As they left, the night settled over the street, calmer than it had in months. The illegal notices, the secret surveillance, and the intimidation tactics that had haunted the community were being dismantled piece by piece. Shelley's reign of petty terror was beginning to collapse from every angle. And yet, I knew better than to assume victory was complete. The final moves, the exposure, the consequences, the legal and social reckoning were still ahead, but the momentum had shifted. The neighborhood was awake, aware, and united. For the first time in this long, twisted cat-and-mouse game, I felt the tide fully turning in my favor. Shelley, predictably, didn't take her suspension quietly. By the next morning, whispers of her plans to reassert control had already begun circulating. Her desperation was palpable. Derek had been quiet since the public exposure. Martin and Clipboard Woman stayed away from her. And even Evan, the construction worker, had gone silent, likely anticipating that any further misstep could ruin her completely. By 8 a.m., the first sign of Shelley's desperation arrived. A flurry of emails sent to board members, each more frantic than the last. Threats, veiled warnings, and references to procedural loopholes littered the messages. "You are making a mistake. I have the right to demand a hearing. You will regret this." I smiled reading them. Predictable, overconfident, and poorly thought out. She believed fear could still work, but the neighborhood and the board had already seen the evidence. Fear had lost its power. Around 10 a.m., I noticed unusual movement across the street. Shelley had arrived in her sedan, not for a board meeting, not to reconcile, but to intimidate anyone who might support the ongoing investigation. She parked deliberately close to several homes, peeking out the windows, taking note of neighbors who had stepped forward. I watched her from my driveway, binder in hand. I decided it was time to push back proactively. I took my phone and began filming. Every action she took, every minute she lingered, every furtive glance toward residents was documented. Within 20 minutes, I had enough footage to prove that she was attempting further intimidation, this time targeting multiple witnesses in the unfolding investigation. She didn't notice me recording. She never had. By noon, the board had convened again, this time reviewing my videos. Martin leaned over and whispered, "She really is trying to interfere with the process." Clipboard Woman nodded. "I've never seen her act like this before. She's panicking." I stayed silent. Let them draw their conclusions. Let them see the truth themselves. Then came the final piece, Shelley's attempt to use Derek and another board ally to spread misinformation among residents, claiming the investigation was a personal vendetta rather than a formal review. I had already captured their communications on video and radio, timestamps included. This was the smoking gun, proof that Shelley's reach extended beyond one incident, that she was actively manipulating both board members and residents to avoid consequences. At 2 p.m., the board turned to me. "Everything you've collected is irrefutable," Martin said quietly. "We now have grounds to fully remove her from the HOA and begin a formal report to local authorities for potential legal violations." Shelley, parked outside, likely didn't yet understand the depth of the net closing around her. I closed my binder, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and anticipation. The cat-and-mouse game that began with my car being towed at dawn had escalated far beyond petty neighborhood squabbles. And now, after months of careful documentation, planning, and patience, the trap had been set for the final fall. By the next morning, word had spread that the HOA's misconduct investigation was underway in full force. I could feel the tension ripple through the neighborhood like electricity. Shelley's desperate moves the previous day had been recorded, documented, and now sat in the hands of the board and legal counsel. The tide had shifted entirely, and the community's attention was on every action that followed. I decided it was time to go one step further. Transparency would be my ultimate weapon. I prepared a concise, well-organized report summarizing the entire saga: the Dawn tow, the Phase 2 surveillance, Derek's trespassing, the fabricated notices, Evan's warnings, and the audio of Shelley's own instructions. Every piece was dated, time-stamped, and cross-referenced with evidence from the HOA's secret folder. Once the report was ready, I sent it to every board member, copying legal counsel, and, crucially, included a version to the neighborhood mailing list. The email was professional, factual, and devoid of emotion. It didn't need anger or theatrics. The facts spoke for themselves. Within minutes, replies started pouring in. Residents expressed shock, gratitude, and relief that someone had acted decisively. For the first time, people who had lived under Shelley's surveillance felt like they had agency. They weren't just witnesses anymore. They were part of the process. By midday, the board convened an emergency neighborhood meeting. Chairs were arranged in the clubhouse, and the air was thick with anticipation. Residents trickled in, whispering, exchanging glances, and occasionally glancing at the empty chair where Shelley might have sat. When the meeting began, I calmly walked up, placing my binder on the podium. "I want to share what's been happening," I said. I briefly summarized the events, showing key photos and clips from the documentation. Every board member and resident could see the timeline unfold: the illegal actions, the intimidation, the secret plans to target a single resident for arbitrary violations. The room was silent. No interruptions, no denials. The evidence was irrefutable. One by one, residents began to speak. They corroborated the events, unsigned notices, trespassing, fabricated complaints. A wave of agreement and validation swept the room. The collective voices, once silenced by fear, now amplified the truth. By the end of the meeting, the board announced immediate corrective actions. Shelley was fully removed from all HOA positions. All her orders were nullified, and the HOA would be restructured to prevent any future abuse of power. Legal counsel confirmed that her actions were being formally reported to local authorities for potential civil and criminal violations. As residents left, many stopped to thank me personally. The street outside, once tense and wary, felt lighter, freer. I glanced back at my burnt orange car parked in the driveway. It had started this chain of events at dawn, and now it stood as a symbol: resilience, vigilance, and the power of meticulous preparation. Shelley had underestimated me. The neighborhood had underestimated the truth. And now everyone could finally see it. The following days were a whirlwind. Shelley's name circulated through legal channels, and her reputation in the neighborhood plummeted almost overnight. Her carefully curated image of authority, competence, and influence evaporated like smoke in the wind. I watched it happen from the safety of my driveway, observing the subtle yet unmistakable ripple effect of truth exposing her tactics. Board members confirmed the internal review had escalated. Shelley's emails, texts, and communications had been preserved as part of the official record. Derek's nighttime, trespassing, and recorded radio conversations were logged as clear evidence of misconduct. Even her attempts to intimidate residents and manipulate the investigation were now documented in multiple formats, leaving her little room to claim innocence or ignorance. Social dynamics in the neighborhood shifted dramatically. Conversations that had once skirted fear now discussed accountability, transparency, and civic responsibility. Residents who had felt powerless were emboldened, openly sharing stories of how Shelley had tried to control every aspect of their lives: illegal fines, secret surveillance, arbitrary rules. One morning, while checking my emails, I received a forwarded notice from the HOA's legal team. Shelley was being formally removed from all HOA leadership positions. Additionally, the board had requested that she attend a mediation session with legal counsel to address her misconduct. Failure to attend would result in potential civil or criminal proceedings. Word spread fast. Neighbors whispered. Some openly celebrated. Even the HOA sedans, once symbols of fear, sat idle in driveways, their drivers now hesitant to appear after months of recorded violations and public exposure. Despite the legal and social victory, I knew the fight wasn't over. Shelley might attempt to appeal or discredit evidence, though the meticulous documentation left little room for her to maneuver. I continued to organize and safeguard the files, making duplicates, timestamps, and metadata all fully verifiable. Preparation was the final safeguard against any lingering attempts at manipulation. Interestingly, Derek and Martin, once reluctant participants in Shelley's plans, began approaching the board proactively, offering statements and corroboration. Their cooperation further solidified the neighborhood's position, and even Clipboard Woman became an unexpected ally, helping to verify details and explain the scope of Shelley's schemes to the community. By the end of the week, the street felt entirely different. The sense of intimidation, control, and fear that had permeated the air for months was gone. Residents felt empowered, validated, and connected. My burnt orange car, once the flashpoint of the war, had become a symbol. Quiet, yet visible proof that meticulous planning, calm strategy, and careful documentation could overturn even the most entrenched abuse of power. Shelley's downfall was now public, her schemes documented, and the neighborhood finally free from her iron grip. With Shelley removed and the investigation well underway, the HOA faced a crucial question: how to rebuild trust within the community. Months of intimidation had left scars, but the residents' newfound confidence offered a chance to reset the culture entirely. I watched closely, knowing that a single misstep could undo the progress we had fought so hard to achieve. The board began implementing reforms immediately. All new notices, fines, and enforcement actions were required to be fully documented, signed, and transparently communicated to residents. Compliance checks now required at least 2 board members present, with written justification for each action. Unauthorized surveillance and personal data collection were explicitly prohibited. Residents responded with cautious optimism. The neighborhood, once tense and wary, now felt alive again. Families strolled down streets without fear of being monitored. Kids played freely in yards, and even HOA meetings were approached with a sense of community rather than dread. People spoke openly about past incidents, ensuring the lessons of Shelley's misconduct were not forgotten. I spent the next few days meeting with board members to provide guidance on maintaining transparency and accountability. Martin, clipboard woman, and even Derek expressed genuine regret for allowing Shelley's schemes to escalate unchecked. They were committed to making the HOA a model of ethical governance, and I offered insight into the specific ways Shelley had exploited loopholes, emphasizing the importance of checks, documentation, and open communication. The residents began to notice the difference immediately. Notices became concise and factual, not punitive or intimidating. Regular board meetings were open to the community, with agendas circulated in advance and minutes posted publicly. Residents who had previously felt powerless were now active participants, asking questions, offering suggestions, and even volunteering for community projects. One afternoon, as I walked past my driveway, I noticed neighbors casually waving, children riding bikes, and families chatting openly in front yards. The burnt orange car gleamed in the sunlight, a quiet reminder of the dawn that had sparked the entire chain of events. The HOA, once a symbol of fear and arbitrary control, was evolving into a community-led organization where authority was tempered by transparency and mutual respect. I realized then that my victory wasn't just personal, it was collective. The cat-and-mouse game that had begun, with a car being towed, had become a catalyst for change across the entire neighborhood. Shelley's reign had ended, but the lessons remained. Careful documentation, strategic action, and community vigilance could turn even the most intimidating adversary into an accountable, transparent figure. The neighborhood was free, the streets felt lighter, the residents empowered, and I knew that the peace we had fought for would endure. If vigilance and integrity continued to guide the HOA, the final chapter of the saga began quietly, but with a sense of undeniable closure. The HOA had fully acknowledged Shelley's misconduct. Legal counsel had documented every infraction, and the board had taken concrete steps to ensure nothing like this could happen again. The neighborhood, once paralyzed by fear, was now alive with renewed energy, participation, and cautious optimism. I spent the morning reviewing my files one last time. Every video, photo, audio recording, email, and notice was carefully labeled, archived, and backed up. Not because I expected retaliation, though that was always a possibility, but because this story had to be complete and defensible. The mistakes Shelley had made would serve as a permanent record of how unchecked authority can spiral into abuse, and how methodical preparation can turn the tables. By late morning, I received word that local authorities had initiated a review of the documented misconduct. While civil action against Shelley was possible, the emphasis was now on preventative measures, ensuring no resident would ever face arbitrary harassment again. The board, now operating with clear checks and transparency, welcomed the oversight as a necessary safeguard. Across the street, neighbors waved, smiled, and began casual conversations. Families emerged in their yards, children rode bikes, and dogs ran freely without fear of compliance patrols. The burnt orange car, once the lightning rod of Shelley's vendetta, gleamed quietly in the driveway, a symbol of resilience and of turning what had begun as intimidation into empowerment. Later that afternoon, the board convened one final review meeting, this time focused on long-term reform. I attended as an observer, providing guidance on procedures to prevent misuse of power, documentation standards, and the importance of resident oversight. Martin, clipboard woman, and Derek were present, and each had changed remarkably from the frightened, complicit figures of the past. They now understood accountability in a way that no lecture could teach. Shelley was not present. Her attempts at interference had been nullified, her position eliminated, and the neighborhood had begun to move forward without her shadow. The board made it clear, no single individual, no matter how seemingly powerful, could undermine the community when rules, transparency, and vigilance were enforced. I stepped outside afterward, breathing deeply. The air felt lighter. The streets were quiet but alive. This wasn't just a personal victory over a vindictive HOA president. It was a collective triumph for accountability, fairness, and the strength of a community that refused to be bullied. The game had started with a car being towed at dawn. It had escalated into a full-scale battle of surveillance, intimidation, and legal maneuvering. But through careful planning, meticulous documentation, and steadfast patience, the final checkmate had been delivered. Shelley's reign of fear had ended. The neighborhood was free, and for the first time in months, I could drive my burnt orange car without a single worry, knowing that every move I had made had ensured justice, and that the cat-and-mouse game was finally over.